for other declarations.
Debbie Abrahams.
I'm co-chair of the APPG for Compassionate Politics.
That completes the declarations, and we can now start the questions. Welcome to our witness. Imran Ahmed, your organisation has done a great deal of research looking at the sources of disinformation and hate speech on social media sites. Obviously, in this last 18-month period, there's been a considerable focus on the role of anti-vaccine conspiracy theories and the influence they have on things like vaccine hesitancy. And your organisation did quite a detailed report identifying the major sources of anti-vaccine conspiracies, highlighting a dirty dozen of top distributors of this disinformation. Could you tell us a little bit about the response you had to that report, both from the technology companies themselves and also the response you've had from people working in public policy within government?
Good morning. Thank you to the committee for inviting CCDH to give evidence today. And it's really great to hear all the range of experience that's being brought to this question. I'm glad as well that Her Majesty's government has decided to take the politics out of this and have this pre-legislative scrutiny, because this is a really important issue. I have, if with the indulgence of the committee, just a short initial statement to perhaps lay out the perspective that we bring to it. And I mean, also to emphasise the strength of feeling from this organisation that has spent the past 5 years now, too publicly, researching the issues at hand. In that time, I have found one central truth. Social media companies are incapable of regulating themselves. Whenever they are given the chance, they put profit before people. In the past year, they faced 3 key tests, and they failed all 3. They failed to take action on racists abusing black and minority sportspeople, which is why we'll have evidence given later from Rio Ferdinand, among others. They failed to take action on US election misinformation, which led to the deadly assault on the US Capitol just down the road from where I live in Washington, D.C. And finally, they're still failing to act on anti-vaccine lies. Now, there are right now people gurgling for breath in ICUs in the United Kingdom around the world who are telling their doctors, I saw this on Facebook, I believed it to be true, I thought the vaccine would harm me. And those people will not survive the lies and misinformation that have been fed to them. We have studied and know through experience the playbook that will be in play over the coming weeks and months of this legislation by the companies to avoid responsibility to accountability. The contempt they've shown civil society, victims, democratically elected politicians, even the President of the United States, as I will go on to show with the Disinformation Dozen. This bill is your chance, our chance, to create a system that incentivizes social media companies to finally protect their users and holds them accountable. So on the question of the Disinformation Dozen, we've been looking at anti-vax misinformation for over a year now. Our first report on it was the anti-vax industry. Our first private report on it was to Her Majesty's government and to the US government in around May last year. We said, COVID's coming, there's going to be a rise in xenophobia because there's a correlation between disgust sensitivity, which is going to be induced during a pandemic, and xenophobia. There's psychological reasons for it, there's neurological reasons for it. They're both co-located in the insular cortex of the brain. That's what Robert Sapolsky, the neuroendocrinologist, told me. That there are complex reasons as to why we're going to see this rise. And the one group that genuinely knows how to weaponize misinformation about health, that has built scale, that has an understanding of the communications, the technology, has also built sustainable economies based on misinformation, is the anti-vax industry. Now, as it happened, we'd already been studying it for the APPG on vaccines, so we had a baseline analysis of what the quantum was, what the size of the anti-vaccine industry looked like, and their follower base on social media. We then put out the anti-vax industry, the anti-vax playbook, which was based on my team managing to attend a secret conference of the world's leading anti-vaxxers. We recorded them for 3 days, explaining how it was that they were going to weaponize the pandemic again and the vaccine against vaccinations as a whole. And finally, we used the Disinformation Dozen has clearly gotten us a lot of attention. President Biden used it cited it in evidence when he said that Facebook were killers. And he was right, by the way. That the Disinformation Dozen are it's based on a concentration analysis. Very simply put, in online worlds, it's no real difference to offline worlds. Influence isn't democratically allocated. Not everyone's voice is the same as everyone else's. And we just did a simple, old-fashioned, actually taken from fast-moving consumer goods, so FMCG analysis of what is the concentration of influence. So whose content is driving the most shares online? And we found a nice statistic. 12 people produced 2/3 of the influence, of the shares. Now, there's a little bit of, showmanship, a bit of theatricality in picking 12 and 2/3, but they're memorable. I think nearly everyone's got that statistic right, apart from President Biden, who's used several different shares in his own testimony.
If I may, just on that point, it would seem from what you're saying is that actually finding sources of disinformation on something like anti-vaccine is not difficult to do. It's reasonably predictable where it'll be, and actually it's quite concentrated in the hands of a relatively small number of networks.
Precisely. And, these 12 people have become really good at using different platforms for different reasons. Now, look, all the platforms are not the same. So there are spaces used to radicalise people. That's Facebook, for example, it's the £800 gorilla in the radicalisation market. That's true when it comes to violent extremism, just as it is with anti-vax. Why? Because you can bring together large communities of people and then feed them information over time. And frequency bias, which is a psychological trait, is such that if we see something frequently, we think it's normal, we think it's true. It's just really simple. Through using Facebook groups, you can colour the lens through which people see the world. So if you drip misinformation into people's feeds on a regular basis into groups, and remembering that last year, Facebook decided to treat groups as friends. So they downgraded news and they upgraded friends, but they made your groups your friends too. So what you get is a higher prevalence of information from within Facebook groups in your feed. And that means that the lens through which you see the world, you see your community, is now infiltrated by bad actors who are spreading misinformation.
So on that, I'd like to bring in some other members who wish to come in on questions as well. What you're saying, it seems to me, is that it's not just that disinformation like anti-vaccine conspiracies, it's not just that it exists on social media, it's not just that it's easy to find and predict. It's not, but the companies, not only do they not act to remove it, they've designed the system that in such a way that it supports the dissemination of that conspiracy theory.
I think that the system they've built is one that is perfect for the dissemination of misinformation that recolours the lens through which people sees the world and leads them down radicalisation pathways. But that the bad actors would have done it anyway. And in one part, it's not just about, you've got this ideal system for them. It's also that there are these bad actors that are experts at weaponizing their spaces, and they tolerate their presence. And really the question is, why do they tolerate their presence? And we do have answers to that. Twitter is used for discourse shaping. It's used to target journalists, target politicians, tell them what the acceptable bounds of discourse are until you get abuse. And that has an effect over time. I mean, all of us here at some point will have been abused online, and you know that it gets to you eventually. There's evidence points. YouTube and Facebook and Instagram are used as evidence points. So you put up your evidence there, and then it's fed into other radicalisation environments, which are used to contextually reshape the way you see the world. All these platforms come together, it's sort of like Lego, and eventually what you have is a palace that is ideal for bad actors to use.
Darren Jones.
Thank you, Chair. Imran, I'm interested in the identification of the 12 individuals, because often the tech companies will say, well, there's millions of pieces of content, we have warehouses of content moderators, AI systems, it's very difficult to find everything. But you've managed to hone it down to 12 individuals, which makes it sound quite easy to just get rid of them. I mean, presumably they have multiple identities. Is it more than 12? If it's down to 12, why are the companies not dealing with them at the root source?
So, keeping in mind that Facebook have responded to disinformation dozen now. I think Monica Bickett, 5 months after our report came out, who's their Vice President of Content Policy, and about a month after President Biden had accused them. I'm just trying to find the statistics now that we have on the number of accounts. So those 12 individuals, actually some of them are couples, and behind them are a network of 501c3s, charities, LLCs. They all own companies which have millions of dollars of revenue. These aren't just 12 random
members of the public. These are sophisticated bad actors. They have 97 accounts between them. Now, Monica Bickett said, CCDH's research is nonsense because there are lots and lots of people who are spreading misinformation. That's true. But these 12 people are the super spreaders. They're nodes in a network. And online spaces are different. They're not flat spaces. They're hierarchical in terms of who are the key influencers. I have 5,500 followers. If I tweet something, 5,500 people might see it. If they tweet something, a couple of million people might see it because they have far more followers than I do. Of those 97 accounts, only 47 as of right now have been removed. So even though they know the 97 accounts, they failed to take down over half of them. They currently still have 7.9 million followers between the 12 of them. 6.3 million have been taken down. Now look, that's not bad. I'm glad that 6.3 million followers, that 47 of their accounts have been taken down. I'm very proud that my organisation has driven that work. However, the job's not done, clearly. And why they won't take them down. Now, in Monica Bickett's response, she said, we have taken action against all 12 of them, even though CCDH's research is nonsense. Trying to sort of have their cake and eat it too. But at the same time, they haven't taken comprehensive action. So the question is, why not, when it is so easy? We've done the hard work of content moderation for them.
Okay, and to me, I mean, this just sounds like an organised crime network.
Yeah.
So what in this bill will stop that from happening?
Well, and look, there is a question here, and there are three things that we've identified as being particularly problematic. First of all, the failure to address hate and misinformation directly on the face of the bill. The second thing is the lack of independence of the audits of social, them marking their own homework, essentially, being able to provide that themselves. And that's a real problem, and I'd like to come to that, because I think that this question of how the companies have managed criticism to date, and there has been criticism to date, is really, really vital to this discussion. The third is criminal liability. Now, you would think if the death toll from any terrorist group was hundreds of thousands, as anti-vaccine misinformation has taken lives, there are people that have died as a result of the misinformation they've been fed online. If you speak to NHS workers, they'll tell you that the people that they see that are coming into ICUs now are unvaccinated, and many of them are unvaccinated because they thought that there was a reason not to take the vaccine because of misinformation that they were consuming online, that they didn't have the resilience to challenge and not to accept. And so you would have thought that criminal liability would be a no-brainer here if they continually fail to act. Now, I think what's critical about CCDH is we can prove, both through our experience of negotiating with those companies, working, for example, with Her Majesty's Government, DCMS, on the Counter-Disinformation Task Force, working with the USG, working with other civil society bodies, we can show you that they fail to act in an honest way with those organisations, but also because we've done the independent auditing work to show how their platforms are being abused, and that even when you, for example, send them reports of misinformation, that if you send them using their own reporting tools, in fewer than 8 in 10 instances do they actually take any action. So I think it's 2 in 10 instances that they take action to take down the misinformation that we identify for them. That's a pretty bad strike rate, 2 in 10, you know. So there is clear evidence that these companies aren't actually doing what they need to be doing.
Thank you. Suzanne Weber.
Thank you, Chair. You said very clearly in your view that Facebook are killers, and talked obviously about the online harm, and obviously what we're aware of, that this leads to offline harm, which is of what we just talked about, which is of great concern. You talk about the misinformation, and it's not just about the vaccine. There's misinformation that goes out to young adults, and particularly, and very vulnerable, and often, you know, we hear about the consequences of that. Have we got the evidence of that direct correlation between online harm that can lead to the offline harm?
Well, at a really simple level, yes, and there are going to be, so there's bits of research to connect this all together. Some of it's going to sound ridiculous. So there is actually research that was done, I think it was done by Heidi Larson's group at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, the Vaccine Confidence Project, to show that misinformation misinforms people. which you would have thought was self-evident, but we've now got the proof that every time someone is exposed to a bit of misinformation, I think it depresses their likelihood to vaccinate by 7.8%. Now, clearly, that if people are misinformed, it is rational for them to come to the conclusion, if they are unresilient to that misinformation, if they trust the material they see online, that they would then not vaccinate. And we have that evidence. So we did correlation analyses, so multiple regression analysis of data that we produced in August 2020 with YouGov. So we asked people if they were likely to vaccinate, and then we asked them a bunch of psychographic questions like, how much media do you consume? What are your attitudes towards scientists, towards government, towards various different figures? Turns out that the best correlator to, and this is across all communities, including African American, Latinx communities in the UK, across Muslim, Jewish, etc., the thing that drives vaccine hesitancy isn't trust in government. That's pretty low everywhere. Trust in scientists is pretty high everywhere. It's trust in social media. It's whether or not someone answers the question. I generally trust what I see on social media. Actually, the best thing that you could do in this pandemic to stop people from believing the material they see on social media is put up a massive banner on the top of every single social media site saying, this site is for entertainment purposes only. You don't know who's put the information that you see here on it. It could be someone that wants to harm you. I did suggest this to Google once, and I think laughingly they decided they said that was a good idea, but they never came back to me on it, funnily enough.
Just following on that, in terms of, you mentioned about the criminal liability is the route to go down. I'm guessing if we're looking at the impact of this information being on there, and the potential that you're saying is killer, I guess that what we've been looking for is how we can put those two together and correlate to be able to sort of pursue that ourselves. We'd need to have the evidence potentially that was a direct link, if you're going to pursue criminal liability as something that should be included.
And we know, so look, there's both connecting the two things. There's connecting the misinformation to offline harm, and there's myriad ways in which we can do that. I mean, there's soft ways and there's hard ways, and there are things in which that isn't going to be clear. So when it comes to racism against footballers, I know that Rio Ferdinand is giving evidence later today. I grew up in Old Trafford, so I'm a huge Man United fan. Marcus Rashford is another one of those footballers that's being abused recently. The point that I've made to their representatives and to others is that the reason why the abuse of Marcus Rashford matters, it isn't because they're a wealthy footballer. It's because if they can call Marcus Rashford the N-word, imagine what they call me or my mum or anyone else from a minority, a woman, a gay person, anyone else. That this is a sense of, these places aren't for you. These are our places. And it's literally the counter-enlightenment in play. All those voices, this room here today, which comprises voices which wouldn't have been permitted to sit at these tables 200 years ago, we fought very hard to bring those voices, including mine. They've fought very hard to bring these voices into these rooms, and they're now being excised from an area which is vital to public discourse and democracy. Let's not underplay how important these are not entertainment sites. They have become, for better or for worse, critical components in how we communicate information to each other. We create social mores in our society, as I learned when I worked for the Labour Party, seeing the infiltration of anti-Semitism into the Labour Party, that digital spaces were being used as the space in which those social mores and values were evolving.
Thank you. Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming here today. You mentioned in your introduction in terms of the rise of misinformation and how that was used within the US presidential election. And I noticed in one of your blogs earlier this year, you reported that Gateway Pundit had earned over $1 million in Google ad revenue in that election. But that particular website between November and January claimed that the US election had been stolen from Donald Trump.
Yes.
Resulted in 50 million visits, nearly a billion clicks from that. And of course, they also promoted the meeting and the rallies on the 6th of January. What do you think, in terms of the scope of the bill, is contained around potential harms? So is there a responsibility of not just direct individual harm, but potential harms? And also, how does the bill address not just individual harm, but societal harm as well?
So this is another problem with the bill, is that it does not deal with the advertising market. So Google has two parts to its advertising business. The first part is it has a display network and it has websites. About a third of all ads revenues, digital ads revenues, Google has. But 95% of the sites that you ever see that have ads on them have ads placed there by Google. So they've chosen breadth over sort of expense. And they have an enormous display network, and what they do is they gobble up sites and they put them in there, including Gateway Pundit, which was spreading election misinformation, the big lie, COVID disinformation, all sorts of malignant and anti-black narratives, and really horrific racist nonsense. We identified that they earned, thanks to that Google Ads monetization, which take advertising revenue from, I think on Gateway Pundit, we actually found Democratic Party adverts placed on Gateway Pundit, a viciously far-right site, which just goes to show that even for the advertiser, it's a terrible waste of money. And most of them are utterly frustrated when they find out about it. That Google has become a primary funder of malignant, violent, racist, anti-Semitic content on the internet. COVID disinformation. I can give you one example of a site that I think I first heard about through Home Office Counterterrorism. And that site we targeted last year, it was covered in adverts for household brands. And we contacted each of those brands. We got all their adverts taken off. The site shut down after the ads disappeared. It just goes to show you that the advertising revenue from Google was vital to the proselytization of hatred into our society, where counterterrorism were telling us that they were concerned about it. Gateway Pundit. So they raised millions of dollars of revenue from Google Ads, and 1.1 million just in 7 months. I'm very proud to tell you that our campaign Stop Funding Misinformation, that story was actually featured in Forbes magazine in the US. I think it was last weekend. Google took them off their display network after a year of campaigning by CCDH, and they are now demonetized, which means that they will not be able to spread their nonsense any further, or with the scale and speed that they were able to before. And that's another thing that I'm very proud of my team for.
Thank you. Ibn Kidron.
Yes. Imran, I have two questions really, and one is about responsibility and one is about intentionality. So I was really interested when the chair asked you a question and sort of said, is it set up to spread this bad stuff? And you actually were quite careful and you sort of backtracked and said, no, actually it's a perfect environment. So I think I'd like you to tell the committee, given that you're our first witness, should we be looking at the intention and unintentional consequences of this system? Is that one of the things we need to do?
So I'm always really cautious when it comes to ascribing the reasons for harm. When I'm asked about the disinformation dozen, and the most frequent question I get asked is, are they doing this on purpose? Are they doing this for the money? And I say, I cannot tell you what resides in the hearts of people, but I can tell you it's curious how much money they make from spreading disinformation. And so I would say the same about the executives of these companies. However, they know, they have been told many, many times, not just by us, civil society, not just by governments, but also internally by their own staff. Shira Frenkel's marvellous new book on Facebook shows you the extent to which there is internally, there are people pushing back, saying, please, we need to do something about these harms. I can tell you right now that I speak to people inside these companies, and they are frustrated at the fact that their executives know about this and are doing little about it. We have worked with, on the DCMS counter-disinformation task force set up around COVID. That was 4 civil society, so 4 charities, or non-profit NGOs, a few academics, some civil servants, ministers, and the companies. And we were giving them all the data. We were telling them what was going on. there was one point at which I think Facebook's representative thanked us all for the work that we'd done identifying the problems on their platform. And I because I'm pokey, I poked back and said, we have hundreds of thousands of dollars of revenue between the four organisations. You have billions. Why on earth aren't you doing this work for yourself? And in one respect, they've both not bothered doing the work because if they did, they'd have moral culpability. But also that when they are told about it, they don't do anything about it either.
I'm going to press you a little bit because I think when I talk about intention versus unintentional, so they are very keen on freedom of expression. But you have actually just said to the committee that some people are being frozen out. So that unintentional consequence of their freedom of expression desire is having this negative. I'm saying to you, is the job of the online safety bill to actually really take a societal look at that and say, in the UK, this is what we think good looks like? Because there are many and complicated balances that we have to look at. And I'm just interested in the unintentional ones.
I feel like the answer is in the question to some extent. Yes, of course. We need to take a broad look at the harms created by these platforms, both intentional and unintentional. But also the way in which rights, I would argue the freedom of speech thing is a defensive play by the companies, sort of first year PPE, I call it, by them on, freedom of speech is absolute. And of course, these aren't platforms that are all about freedom of speech. These aren't public squares. Their algorithms mean that they pick winners and losers in the content game. The spreaders of hate and misinformation are able to bully their opponents off that space to narrow the space in which their opponents can operate. The prevalence of hate speech and misinformation damages free speech in other ways. You haven't got free speech if you're a black footballer and 100 racist people jump down your throat every time you post. In fact, the barrier to entry for you to using this vital tool for promoting your brand, for transacting business, is taken away from you. But also, more fundamentally, I've always felt it remarkable that the companies have been able to get away with the first time I've heard anyone accuse the companies of being responsible for the harms they create. It was when President Biden called them killers. And I've been arguing this with executives there for quite some time, that at what point is there culpability? If you know there's harm being created by your product, what other industry gets away with this?
Mm-hmm. Can I finish with this then, just about responsibility, because you've taken me right there, which is in your evidence. You say, disappointingly, platforms have increasingly passed the burden of dealing with trolling onto individual users through features to filter abuse. Would you be disappointed in a bill that gave them the responsibility to create user tools? And do you think it needs to be upstream, the sorts of response the bill should be having to create safety? Is it with them or is it with the user?
It's outrageous to literally tell black, gay, women, it's not just about minorities, it's also about, I've been advising scientists who've been working on the vaccine, who've been getting unbelievable amounts of abuse about the fact that they are trying to put microchips in people or nonsense like that, threatening their families. In fact, I'm not meant to talk about the threats that CCDH gets, but I can tell you the anti-vaxxers give better death threats than anyone else. They're very good fun. They're completely bananas. There are so many organisations which are being bullied off those platforms, and I think it's a really important component of it. I would make this point as well, that when it comes to the free speech debate, we track the litigation that these companies put in. So when it comes specifically to the First Amendment question in the US, the companies, when they're in litigation, when they're being sued by, for example, members of the Disinformation Dozen or by hate actors. So publicly, the hate actors say, if we lose our platform, we'll go somewhere else. And publicly, Facebook say, well, they kind of have a First Amendment right to say what they want to say. In the litigation, the hate actors say it's destroyed our business. So one of them said it demolished his ability to spread misinformation. Another one said that it destroyed his business, the economics behind it. Because, of course, in the courts, they have to prove tort. So they have to lay out what the harm is. And the companies say, they don't have a First Amendment right. This is our platform. We have the First Amendment right. No court can tell us what to put on our platform, and this guy's an idiot. So, sling one.
Thank you.
Tim Clement-Jones.
Thank you, Chair. A couple of questions. Very powerful testimony on misinformation, disinformation, Imran. And you've mainly talked about Facebook and Google, and I wondered if, in a sense, this was absolutely right across the board, this kind of behaviour that you've been describing, or failure to act, is common right across the board on the platforms, or whether there is any of the social media platforms or search platforms have best practice. Is there anything that one can draw upon for the purposes of the future code? And then I think the secondary question there is whether we should be making a distinction in terms of misinformation, disinformation spreading between the larger platforms and the smaller ones, as the bill does.
Well, look, there are rational reasons for splitting out the larger platforms from the smaller platforms. And ironically, the ones that like to talk most about the impact on smaller platforms are the larger platforms, which are trying to cover up their central role in the spreading of disinformation and hate throughout our societies. I think that we're going to struggle with this bill to find the right balance between the prescriptions that need to be put into place for large companies and small companies. And I think that like the disinformation doesn't, you should focus as much as possible on where the greatest quantum of harm is caused. And the greatest quantum of harm is caused by Twitter, which is vital in the shaping of discourse, on Google, which owns both YouTube, which is which is one of the most resistant platforms to taking action to enforce their own rules. And keep in mind that one of the cute things that the team does at CCDH is that we always measure up the content that we're looking at by their own rules. We look at the enforcement of their own rules. And one of the things I would urge is that, at the moment, the decision making by companies, the transparency of how they enforce their rules just is severely lacking. And there is, in one respect, a very easy solution that would work in both the UK and the US and some of the other jurisdictions we work on. Is that if there was transparency of enforcement and how they enforce their rules, if there's transparency of algorithms and how they decide what wins and what loses on their platform, and if there's transparency of the economics, of the advertising market, of other aspects of how they generate their wealth, their immense wealth, you could get most of the way to a solution that would make it impossible for them to function as they are right now, with the arrogant insouciance, the lack of transparency, and their ability to turn around to governments and go, that's not the way it works, you don't know the way it works, only we know the way it works. And of course, that's part of their playbook. So I think that there are various aspects of this bill. This is a really, and one of the hardest things about this bill is, as the Carnegie Trust have said very clearly, this is a really complicated bill. And I don't envy you having to get your heads around every single clause and subclause and power within it. The question isn't necessarily, are there going to be sufficient powers? And I think we've identified some areas in which there aren't sufficient powers on the fact independence of audits, hate and misinformation being clear on the face of the bill, criminal liability. But the question is whether or not the regulator is going to be able to wield those powers with sufficient confidence and effectiveness to give us the results socially that we want.
It sounds as though algorithmic inspection is a really important part of what you're suggesting in terms of transparency.
We put out a report a few months ago called Malgorithm, which looked at the way the algorithm works. So I think it was September 2020, when Facebook bought Instagram, they said that they wouldn't Facebookize Instagram. That was their promise to the founders. And the founders of Instagram then left because Facebook, of course, then Facebookized Instagram. In August, September 2020, they decided to change the algorithm that ran on the front page of Instagram. So it used to be that if you got to the end of your feed, it would say, well done, you've caught up. Now it started recommending you posts that you should read. So we thought it's a great opportunity to find out how it recommends things. So we set up a series of different accounts, each of which followed only 10 accounts, each an archetype. So one was following health authorities, one was following wellness accounts, one was following anti-vaxxers, one was following anti-Semites, one was following QAnon. And we saw what recommendations came out. In short, if you follow wellness, it would feed you anti-vax. If you followed anti-vax, it would give you QAnon. If you feel anti-Semitism, if you followed QAnon, it would give you anti-vax and COVID disinformation. We found the algorithm, whether it's by design or by experience of trillions of clicks, had realized that conspiracist information is addictive and it keeps people on platform. If you can deepen and broaden people's conspiracism and their extremisms, you can keep them on platform for ages, because where do you go for misinformation and conspiracy? You go to their platforms. So they create a captive audience. And why do they do that? Because eyeballs equals ad revenues equals more money for them. And that's all and in reality, I think the algorithms will end up being very simple. They just say, what do I have to do to keep people on this platform for as long as possible to make as much money as possible? And once that is genuinely known, once people genuinely understand both the simplicity of those algorithms, the failure to act on malignant content, and the impact on our societies, I don't think it would survive anyway in the condition that they are at the moment.
Thank you. A quick final question, Chair. Following up what Debbie had to say on societal harms, and if you go for that, it doesn't have to just be an individual harm. How on earth do you define a societal harm for the purposes of the bill?
Well, luckily that's not my job. I look forward to seeing your solution on it. Look, I think that you're going to have to take a very broad view of societal harm. You've got later on today my friend and colleague Danny Stone from the Anti-Semitism Policy Trust. There is a price that is incredibly clear and a harm that is incredibly clear that comes with misinformation and hate.
What you're saying from your responses there would seem to be that if someone starts engaging with a certain type of conspiracy theory, they will see others on different topics.
They'll be fed others. I was told by the civil service that the one report Facebook really pushed back on by CCDH was Malgorithm. Not Disinformation doesn't, not any of the others. That's the one they really pushed back on. And I was delighted when the civil servant said that he turned around to Facebook and said, well, perhaps you're right. Perhaps CCDH are wrong about how your algorithm works. But there is evidence that there is harm because it's clear they've got screenshots. So perhaps that's a good chance for us to have an independent inspection of how your algorithm works. And I thought that was a very clever answer.
You can see why they would push back on that, because rather than blaming someone who's posting bad content, you're blaming their system as being the problem. John Nicholson.
Thank you, Chair. Why do you think it is that people choose to believe disinformation rather than their doctor?
Well, I mean, so there are lots of different reasons. It's access as well. So as anything else, that in the middle of a pandemic, we've been physically dislocated from GP surgeries, that we've had... where's the information that we've seen been coming in from? We've been stuck at home, we've been stuck behind computers. Those computers have been giving us... 2020 has shown, the scale of disinformation on those platforms, but also the power of social media. And I never want to discount that. I moved to DC in July 2020. The social media is the main way in which I expressed vulnerability, gained succor, felt love from my friends, saw things which were important to my life. And in amongst that, I know that there was vast amounts of misinformation flowing. So it's the prevalence of it. It's the centrality of these platforms as a means of communication, and the fact that they are inherently, irredeemably laced with misinformation. That one of those primary information environments that we exist in is laced with misinformation. That's one reason. The other reason is that, so there are psychological correlators for why people believe misinformation rather than good information or information from health authorities. And don't forget, the UK has done pretty damn well when it comes to vaccination compared to the US. Why is that? In part because we have an institution in the UK that commands more trust than the US health system has. We have the NHS. And this is about it's epistemic authorities. It's about who has the right to tell you what the truth is or not. And in the UK, the NHS is trusted and loved by most people, and so therefore it's done pretty well. What drives conspiracist thinking, epistemic anxiety? A lack of knowledge about not just what the truth is, but how to find the truth.
In your opinion, are there any people who are particularly susceptible as groups to the disinformation? Because, for those of us who've grown up getting jags in our arms as babies, we've believed the National Health Service. We've believed that inoculations, jags is a Scottish usage. We believe that we'll be kept safe by inoculations. Why would we suddenly turn round and believe some random on Facebook rather than a health service we've trusted our whole lives, taking your point that it's less prevalent here than elsewhere?
What we're talking about, though, is 60 million people follow spaces which are controlled by anti-vaxxers on social media. That number hasn't changed over the pandemic, by the way. For all the action they claim to have taken, there are still 60 million people following these spaces. It went up by about 10 million at the start of the pandemic. And so what we've seen is it's not a symmetrical question. It's not about people either believe in vaccines or they don't believe in vaccines. They're hesitant. If I saw children are important to me, something I'd like in my future. If someone said to me that this jab might cause harm to a child, I would be horrified. I'd stop for a second. I'd think, well, crumbs, I don't really want to do that. It's about making people pause. Vaccine hesitancy. So many of the people in those hospitals gasping for breath right now who are inflicted with COVID did it because they were waiting to see if the vaccine was dangerous. That's what they were really doing. It's vaccine hesitancy, not being anti-vax. And it's an asymmetric battle. We are actually the change agents. We're telling people, get off your bums, go to the doctor, go and get your jab. That's the change state, right? They're just saying, don't. Just sit there. Keep watching Netflix.
What's the motivation of the anti-vaxxers?
If you can divorce people from so anti-vaxxers are like any type of groomer or recruiter. You can look at, say, the way that AQ used to recruit, or Hezbollah, or also the way in which child sexual exploitation works. This is about making people not trust the authorities that they normally trust. Anti-vaxxers only have 3 actual messages. Forget all the sort of the nonsense about memes. Look at the themes. COVID isn't dangerous. Vaccines are dangerous or unsafe, or there's something funny about them, and therefore the people pushing those 2 things, the doctors, they can't be trusted because they're compromised. There's only 3 messages in there. And I think it's the simplicity of what they have to communicate that actually and we have failed on multiple levels. We've done things like engage with individual memes, actually giving oxygen to the idea that microchips are in the vaccines, or we've given oxygen to nonsense that, hydroxyquinolone, that now ivermectin. I keep being asked by US media people to do stuff on ivermectin. I say, I absolutely refuse to do it. I don't want to talk about it. That's not what this is about. This is about telling people that you don't need to go and get the vaccine. You could just take some horse tranquilizer.
And what's the battle plan, do you think, of the platforms long term to keep going? Because I was quite interested, because I also sit on the DCMS committee, and we had a boss of TikTok in front of us, and their argument was that they take down COVID disinformation, and we said, you clearly don't. And my office staff managed to find a very glamorous young woman who was pushing COVID disinformation. And she had more than 100,000 hits for this COVID disinformation, saying you're injecting yourself with babies. Now, what was interesting was that the TikTok boss who appeared before us didn't offer free speech defence, didn't say, well, she's entitled to put out the message if that's what she wants to. It's all about free speech. Their argument was this is absolutely horrific, and we do everything possible to take this stuff down. Yeah. Clearly not the case. So are they operating different defences simultaneously, both the free speech defence and the we are completely incompetent defence?
So free speech is an earlier part of their playbook. They have a playbook. There's 4 Ds. Deny, initially. So initially they said that anti-vax stuff, it's not causing a big problem. And it's not against our rules anyway. Don't forget, anti-vax misinformation was at the start of the pandemic, not against Facebook's rules. It was only at Christmas time when there was a huge amount of attention as a result of multiple organisations, including CCDH with the anti-vax playbook, showing how the platforms were being abused by anti-vaxxers, that they changed their policy on that. So initially you deny. Second, you deflect. You say, lots of people feel this way. This is a societal problem. This isn't about what's happening on our platform. Even though there are no water coolers anymore, in the last year, this has been a perfect experiment. And if information was ordered by Mark Zuckerberg, what would the world look like? Turns out it's, domestic terrorism at the Capitol and people choking to death in ICUs. The third phase is delay. So that once they've accepted responsibility and they said we're going to do something about it, they say, absolutely, we're going to do something really big about this. But we can't do it all at once. I mean, how on earth can we do that? So they say, we'll deal with it. But they always delay and delay and delay. And the reason why they detest us, which I know is true, is because we expose how severe that delay is and the impact of that delay, their failure to act, even when they accept that they must act. And then finally, they throw dollars at it. So deny, deflect, delay, and then dollars. And look, the dollars are a big issue. In 2020, Amazon and Facebook spent twice as much as Exxon and Philip Morris on lobbying. Big tech spent $120 million on lobbying in just 2020, in the election year. 94% of Congress with jurisdiction over privacy and antitrust have received money from a big tech corporate PAC. In the UK, I can tell you that I go to meetings in which I see civil society bodies who come out against a CCDH position. I always go back and check who their funders are, and I always find big tech among their funders. The tentacles of big tech are everywhere. A question you should be asking everyone that submits evidence to you is, do you take money from big tech? Because I'm going to dinners, to lunches, to debates every day in which I'm dealing with organisations that are essentially bought part and parcel of the big tech lobbying machine. And that's what you're up against. It's a truly courageous sales that you're taking on for that reason, because you're coming up against the most powerful, impressive lobbying machine assembled in history. There's a reason why Facebook keeps putting adverts in the New York Times, full-page ads saying, we're ready for Section 230 reform of the Communications Decency Act, which gives them no liability for the content on their platforms. It's because they know this is coming, they're ready for it, they've got some of the finest political minds in the world working on it, and Nick Clegg too.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dean Russell.
Thank you, Chair. Just wanted to touch on a couple of points. You mentioned right at the start, you gave 3 examples of big issues, anti-vax being one of them, the awful incidents in the Capitol in Washington. How are these connected? I mean, are you finding that actually the same organisations are actually spreading misinformation in different ways to the same groups of people and perhaps trying to widen that audience?
I mean, this is one of the things that the serious part of the job where we talk to counter-terrorism in the US and UK is convergence and hybridisation of these forces. So one of the problems with the problem with social media is that it's zero marginal cost for each additional communication to each additional person. The actual fundamental technical change to how communications happens and the economics of it is enormous. It's like the nuclear bomb. It's unlimited amounts of energy from zero. And so if you can communicate to theoretically 4.5 billion people for zero cost, you're able to market to new groups. What we've seen over the pandemic is the cross-marketing of different types of extremism to each other. And that leads to convergence. So on January the 6th, we had a stage which had anti-vaxxers, the Oath Keepers, the far-right white supremacist group. We had George Papadopoulos, Roger Stone, a whole sort of array of bad guys on that one platform. They'd converged in physical space after initially converging and marketing to each other, realising that there was an opportunity to sell the same idea that you can't trust the government, that they're out to get you, that there's a great big conspiracy. What we're seeing now is hybridization. So once you form these converged new organizations, you see mega conspiracy conspiracies being used to hybridize them. So QAnon brought together suburban moms with white supremacists, with Trump supporters, with a whole array, with people who were just worried about children. The new one is the Great Reset, which is replacing QAnon. And QAnon is basically dead. QAnon minus the paedophile weirdness and Donald Trump being the world's greatest paedophile hunter, and instead with the idea that the vaccines are being used to kill people. That's the Great Reset conspiracy theory, which is now the mobilizing conspiracy theory behind the eruptions of violence that we're seeing in real life today.
Thank you. And with regards to that then, you mentioned earlier about this huge amounts of money here that's being funded into these conspiracy creators, as it were. Where's that money coming from? You mentioned earlier, you said about bad actors, as it were, and you mentioned charities, you mentioned business. Interestingly, you didn't say the word governments, and I just wonder, is there a bigger issue here around security globally?
So, I mean, we don't do government work. We're not a quasi or semi or in any way espionage agency. We don't take money from governments either, to be very clear, nor do we take it from big tech. So we aren't equipped and we aren't capable of identifying infiltration by governments. Part of the reason for that is that the people that have access to IP level data that you would need to understand it and to look at masking, for example, are the companies themselves, and they have teams internally to do that. Part of the reason is it's just not our wheelhouse. There are organizations like ISD, the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, run by Sasha Havlicek, which is an incredible organization. They're very good at that, and they work with governments and with DHS and others to do that sort of work. But I mean, the way I've always explained it is, it's a no-brainer. Look, if you want to kill British people or American people, the best thing you could do now is, if you're a Russian tech person, is go and like the posts of bad actors from within our society. So it's injecting heat into an existing fissure in our society, trying to cause an earthquake.
And if I may, just on the pool of people you mentioned earlier, I think 60 million has been a sort of standard amount of people that are following the anti-vax conspiracy theories, as it were. I used to do a lot of work in AI and psychology AI before becoming an MP, and the use of language, the way that things are phrased, can have a powerful impact on what people believe and their actions. Are those 60 million the same, and are they all sort of people who watched the X-Files TV show and thought it was a documentary, or is it the reality that that they're changing and swapping and changing? Actually, the language that's being used and spread by these platforms is actually convincing people that previously perhaps wouldn't have been convinced about conspiracies and about misinformation.
Yeah, and they use really sophisticated tools to bring them in. I mean, propaganda works. There's a reason why we study propaganda. But for example, the anti-vaxxers talks about creating answering spaces, so waiting for people to express anxiety and then jumping on them with a bit of misinformation that bridges them into. And the disinformation does are worthwhile looking at for so many reasons, but one of them is that they're comprised, like an industry, they each have a different brand and market. So one of them will target sort of, moms who are into yoga and wellness in California. One will target Trump voters. One will target another segment. And they have both the bridging identity and the bridging arguments to draw people into extremisms.
And just finally from me, if I may, Chair, just related to that, are you finding in your algorithms report and so on, are those algorithms seemingly targeting more vulnerable people in society?
Look, if there's 60 million people across the US and UK who are following spaces, then this isn't about vulnerable or not vulnerable. This isn't about smart or stupid. It isn't about race. Smart people are just as vulnerable to conspiracy theories for a variety of reasons, not least of all because they're more confident that they know what the truth is once they've worked out what they think the truth is, that they're using the evidence in front of them. So being clever isn't resilience enough. You need to do some work to remove the content itself. And the platforms are feeding that content in. When I'm in rooms full of smart people, I always ask the question, what vegetable helps your eyesight? And everyone always goes, carrots. And I remind them that was
Ministry of Information and Propaganda during the Second World War to hide the fact that we had plane-mounted radar. So we told people that we'd been growing carrots and feeding it to our pilots so they could see at night. But even now, are any of you going to go ahead and, you know, I do this, then my favourite thing to do is follow up with a question asking, well, now that you know that it's just propaganda, are you still going to tell your kids to eat carrots? And everyone goes, yeah.
So the kids aren't listening, Imran. Jim Knight.
Thank you. In your evidence, you talk about the bill failing to address the harms caused by online advertising and go on to talk about your report on that and campaign on that. What would you like the bill to do in respect of online advertising, and why wouldn't we have the Advertising Standards Authority regulate that?
I mean, I'm not sure whether or not this is within the scope of the bill. Advertising at all. And I know that there are other things going on in government, and I've spoken to civil servants about that, and they assure me that things are going to happen on advertising. There's one simple answer. So I talked about transparency earlier, and about, you know, I like freedom of speech. I'm a lefty. I believe that everyone should have the right to say what they think. And I think that the platforms should be more transparent, not less transparent. There should be more speech when it comes to algorithms, to enforcement, and to the economics of those organisations. If every single advertiser knew where their adverts were appearing and had to, for example, publish it on a page on their website, then my team wouldn't have to go and identify to them that their ads were appearing on malignant content sites, because Google would have to tell them, which they're very slow at doing, where their ads are really appearing, and they're sort of through networks of intermediaries. So let's just say we had a law in the UK where every single brand on their website, in the same way that I have to publish my registered address on my website and who the company is for, had to just have a page where you could see where their ads appear. It would clean up the problem immediately, because no one would want to advertise on a malignant content site, and you would give the tools to civil society to do the right job. So that's a very, very, very quick and smart solution. You could call it the Stop Funding Misinformation amendment, but that would quickly fix this bill and end in one fell swoop the way that Google Ads funds malignant content that causes so much harm to our society.
And the ASA and how that might relate to Ofcom? You mentioned that in your evidence.
I mean, do I think the agencies as they're equipped right now? Clearly not, because we haven't been doing a great job at actually identifying the way in which malignant content has been used today. I mean, this hasn't been on their radar. I get more interest from companies themselves. I'm actually speaking at the Adweek conference in a few months to talk about exactly this, asking companies to take responsibility for where their ads appear and what content they appear. The problem is that if you've bought a package of 500,000 eyeballs, you don't, you just want the eyeballs.
And they're algorithmically placed in themselves, those ads.
Absolutely. Programmatic advertising, they call it. But what it means is an abrogation of their responsibility to ensure they're not funding bad content. And it means that every time you go and buy, something from the supermarket, you're inadvertently, by accident, thanks to Google, funding election misinformation that leads to riots, to COVID misinformation that leads to death.
Thank you. Black.
Thank you. I wholly agree with you that actually the best single thing we could do is actually introduce transparency into the ad supply market. And I think it would be very useful if you had any ideas about how the bill could be amended to let the committee have that, especially if it's a simple amendment. I just wanted to ask, on the subject of regulators, whether you think Ofcom is the right regulator, and if so, are the powers that are given to it under the bill sufficient?
So there are things missing from their powers, and there are things that have been passed on to Ofcom. For example, having to decide whether or not to introduce or to recommend criminal sanctions. There are the fundamental thing to me is whether or not they have the power to commission independent audits that can go into the companies and check if what they're giving us is true. But also the missing statistics. One of the questions we ask all the time is,
how much of the hate identified do you take down? And they always come back and give us the non sequitur statistic. 90% of the information we take down is detected by algorithms before it even hits the site. That's not what I asked. It's not the question. I mean, that there are a number of things that we've been incapable of getting at them. So Ofcom's ability to commission that independent data. But I think in part there is a question of whether or not they're going to be able to knit together confidently the mix of civil society, of their regulatory powers of government, of criminal sanctions, to hold these companies accountable. And my fear is that they will be treated with the same contempt that, for example, the FSA was by investment banks in the early noughties and late 90s, which is that they will never have the scale of powers required, nor will they be confident enough to wield them to protect society from the harms being created on these platforms.
Yeah. That point about independent audit is absolutely crucial. Do you think the bill, as it stands, does that?
No, it doesn't. It needs independent auditing powers in there. It needs the ability to go in and get other bodies, not just self-reporting. You cannot ask Facebook to mark their own homework. That's why we are where we are. Self-regulation is over. It's got to be over. And the funny thing is that I keep being told that this sort of regulation can't happen anywhere in the world. I keep being told it can't happen in the US. But I've got a solid bet that it's one of those things where everyone's telling you in advance why it can't happen. And then once it does happen, they'll be telling you why it was inevitable that it was going to happen.
That's one important recommendation we can make.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Stephen Gilbert.
Okay. Give us the bills quickly, marks out of 10 for dealing with any of the issues you've described.
Well, I love a reductive statistic, which is why we wrote the Disinformation dozen, but I don't want to mark Her Majesty's government. I think that it is, so let's start at the beginning. It is the most ambitious legislation anywhere in the world. It is a phenomenal display of confidence and strength as the UK legislating, and better or for worse, it's an independent Britain. We're able to put together our own regulation when it comes to social media, and I think that the whole of the world is looking to the UK right now. The whole of the world is looking to this committee. I know there are colleagues in the US right now who are doing a 5 a.m. watch party of this particular session to see what's happening. So this is really, really important what's happening here. And the bad guys are watching too. You know, in one respect, my job is split between, I think of the bad guys as being, I can't change a Nazi. So my job is to disrupt their work. My job with the companies is to make them take responsibility, because they're not Nazis, they're not anti-vaxxers, they are actually rational people. And it's like anything, with any industry, think of the industry as amoral and gaseous. It will expand to fit whatever framework you put around it. We've just got to make sure that we're starting to put some sort of regulatory framework to give them the boundaries of what we consider to be acceptable. And it is actually our fault for having failed. The US literally legislated to create no liability whatsoever for social media companies for any of the content posted on their site, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, an act in retrospect of such enormous naivety. Because if you remove the framework, what you get is the companies racing to the bottom. And what we need to do is give them the framework so they know, well, these are our expectations of society. It's actually the decent thing to do.
Okay, so we're sending a very powerful signal, and you think in many ways we are taking the lead. Can we just have a look at how the provisions are going to work? Because you said it was a very complicated bill. It is a very complex bill, and it's a lot of work needs to be done on the drafting to make it simpler. But it does three basic things. It puts a series of duties of care on platforms. To protect children from harmful content. We haven't discussed that today, and I think that's more relevant for other witnesses. To remove illegal content, and quite a lot of the stuff you've been talking about today is illegal content, not all of it, quite a lot of it is. And to protect adults from content that is legal but harmful. And it does that by putting a duty on the companies to have a look at how their systems work, identify potential problematic areas, and put in place a policy to deal with them. And all of that responsibility is on the companies. It's overseen by Ofcom, but the responsibility is on the companies. It seems to me that nothing much changes, that the companies will decide what's harmful, Maybe there's some change in terms of illegal content. Maybe we will be able to ensure that companies take down illegal content much faster, and Ofcom will be on that case. But it seems to me there's no change at all in relation to harmful content. It will be defined by companies. Their policy for dealing with it could be not to deal with it, and as long as they're open and transparent about it, nothing has changed.
I mean, you're absolutely nailing the problem. The problem with the powers in the framework. That, first of all, the lack of that, you're asking the companies to mark their own homework, but you're also in one respect asking them to set their own rules and set the test itself, and that is deeply problematic. As it happens, when it comes to setting the test, their rules for the main part are incredibly fair and stringent. I mean, they do ban disinformation, they ban lies about vaccines, they ban hatred, but they just don't enforce them. So there is an enforcement thing, and CCDH has tended to focus on the failure to act and not on policy development. My colleagues like Danny Stone have been incredibly powerful in forcing them to evolve their policies, working with them from the inside and getting them to see dehumanising behaviours, for example, another form of hatred. But I mean, I've got to be honest that I am frustrated by this, because I know that civil society are the ones who've driven them to the position they're in now, but we need to hand the baton off to government, to legislators, because we cannot keep absorbing the cost. I mean, that's why companies are taking money from Facebook and Google, because it's expensive. I mean, I've got 14 members of staff. How do you think we pay for them? It's hard work, and it's not glamorous or well-paid work either. The second thing is that we also have to take the threats. So, I think I alluded to death threats and things like that. But, I mean, for example, right now, CCDH is coping with the fact that we have been... we've been sued by one of the Disinformation dozen, who's accused us not of defamation, but of something quite extraordinary, of breaching their right to a reputation as part of their private life under EU human rights legislation. But it's costing us thousands of pounds, of course, to defend that, because we have to defend it as serious things. We have felt abandoned by government, which is it's convened things, but hasn't given itself the powers nor taken the responsibility of doing what has to be done. With the indulgence of the committee, I could submit as written evidence some of the examples of the sorts of threats that civil society have had to endure, including the legal threat from this member of the Disinformation dozen. So you can see what it is that is happening as a result of the failure of government to act to date.
Okay, the bill is also full of quite vague definitions. So a content that is harmful to adults isn't defined. It's not clear who should define it. You said that you didn't want to get involved in defining societal harm, and I'm sure many other people wouldn't. The bill leaves most of this to platforms. Who should make these definitions? Who should create the framework? Should it be platforms? Should it be Ofcom? Should it be the Secretary of State, or should it be Parliament?
My Lord, I'd like to see it on the face of the bill. I think these things should be put on the face of the bill. I think your definitions of hate and misinformation and the fact that they are covered by this bill should be on the face of it. I think the definition of the harms that are being addressed, there needs to be flexibility, obviously, to have them added in. But the system as it exists now of not having that clarity, the less clarity there is, the actual harder it is on those companies to do the right thing, and the more wiggle room there is for them to escape from it. And they will escape from it. They'll always be probing the edge of the legislation, and they have the best lawyers, they have the best public affairs, they have the best public relations. If you're in DC and you're trying to find a law firm to represent you, which we had to do, finding one that doesn't have a conflict of interest because they also act for one of the big tech companies is near impossible. So I think we've ended up with one of the only 2 or 3 firms in which you can actually have them represent you if you take on big tech.
Thank you. The final question from Darren Jones.
Thank you, Chair. Just a very quick supplementary following your discussion earlier on the exclusions for paid-for advertisements. I'm interested in this definition that we discussed earlier between an individual posting something and organised criminals posting things. Presumably, organised criminals will just pay for their advertisements in order to get through a loophole in the bill here. And if you agree with that, from your study, do you know how much of the content you reviewed was already paid for advertisements?
Some was. So anti-vaxxers were able to advertise on their platforms until mid last year. A lot of the election misinformation is paid ads. We've got a report coming out next week on paid ads that we've seen on the platforms that do something really, really horrific. It is one of the most challenging pieces of research we've ever put out in terms of the content that they accepted money for paid ads for. But yeah, dealing with transparency. Then they currently have some degree of transparency with their ad library, but as usual, it's unwieldy. They make the way in which you interface with their transparency mechanisms as complex as possible. So there's a tiny technical, really nerdy issue here that we should also, when you're defining what their transparency looks like and determining their APIs, the way in which you interface with their platforms at a technical level and are able to draw the information out of their systems, and the flexibility you have to combine data to have compound variables as well as just variables that you're looking at is really important.
So exclusions for paid for advertisements is a problem?
Of course.
Thank you.
Bananas.
Thank you. Imran Ahmed, thank you very much for your evidence.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.